Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks everybody for logging on and participating in today's seminar. It's an honor for me to be part of this and to be talking about the role and the relevance that media and communication, and of course the field of media studies and communication research, can play in this global pandemic / infodemic that we're all experiencing, that we're all part of. And I wanted to talk about, or I want to make 8 points today, 8 sort of insights that the field of media studies and communication research contributes to what's going on in the world right now, helps us to understand certain processes, helps us to appreciate the role that media play in all of this, in a situation where it's ostensibly not about media, but it's about our bodies, right? A virus that may or may not affect us or the people we care about. Yet my argument today will be very much that situation cannot be seen as separate from the role media and communication play. And the significance of that statement I hope to underscore with my presentation. So I want to start with the first of my 8 points today by looking at a very basic question, a question that has been posed many times, most explicitly and beautifully, I think, by my British colleague Richard Silverstone in a book from 1999. Why study the media? I mean, why should we care about media and communication in all of this to begin with? In other words, what's the answer to the so what question? And I do want to go back to this book from 1999, which in media terms is ancient history. Because Professor Silverstone in his book answers this question by saying that when using media, we're all part of what he calls the production of enchantment. Now that sounds quite beautiful and relatively innocent, but it is actually quite a fundamental point. And let's not forget, this point was made in 1999, well before the age of social media and iPads and iPhones and so-called smart technologies. What is this production of enchantment and how are we all involved in this? The idea is that in media, we actually co-create reality itself. The reality that we experience on a day-to-day level is in fact produced in and through media. It doesn't exist independent of our media. And while this may sound like a bit of a philosophical point, it's actually quite a straightforward point. And I know you've all experienced it today. For example, maybe at some point today, somebody asked you, what's the weather like today? Now, ask yourself, when somebody asks you that question, do you look up at the sky or do you look down at your screen? The answer is you're looking down at your screen. To open some kind of app that tells you what the temperature is and whether it's raining or not. I mean, why would we look up, right? We have all the data. Or when we navigate a new city. A couple of years ago, I had the profound privilege to visit Russia for the first time, visiting St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I caught myself navigating the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow, looking at Google Maps on my phone, rather than just, strolling around these absolutely gorgeous cities. Now, these are 2 very innocent examples of a much broader point, is that the media produce a certain reality for us, and by using them, we co-create that reality very much. Remember the last time you perhaps attended a concert or a demonstration, and your account of this event was completely different than somebody else who was there as well, or an authority's account, or the account of a police officer, of the organizer, but you were all at the same event. The second point I wanted to make has to do with this rather unique situation that when the World Health Organization in February in 2020 announced that, yes, we are all experiencing a pandemic, it did at the same announcement make a fairly profound claim, profound especially for us in the field of media and communication research, because it said that parallel to the pandemic, we are also experiencing, as the World Health Organization said, an infodemic. And this was incredibly important, the infodemic can be just as fatal as the pandemic. In other words, this was a public organization, an authority that, in my mind, for the first time in history, made something clear that in the field of media studies has been a point of theoretical consensus for about 10 or 15 years, which is that the reality of the media and the reality outside of media cannot be meaningfully separated anymore, which of course followed from my first point, why should we study the media in the first place? And now to be hearing this from the World Health Organization was a profound point. And it underscored how the real and the virtual, how media and life aren't two separate domains, two realms that affect each other, that where we can draw a line that what happens in real world, gets mirrored in the media or vice versa. No, things are not that simple anymore. We've clearly crossed a certain threshold, a new way of understanding, of looking at the world that consists, yes, of trees and mountains and people and roads and buildings, but also of zeros and ones, of data, of images, of sounds, of noise, and that together they make up our reality that is both physical and virtual simultaneously. And this is, I think, a really profound point that is sort of like the first week of every media and society course on any university anywhere in the world. But now it's become sort of common sense. And I think that is truly a significant step in our field. A third point that I want to make has to do with something that is now happening in everybody's home, which is a process that you could label as a dual convergence, which is a point that my colleague Christian Fuchs has made earlier this year in an important paper. And I think it's well made and important for us to sort of be aware of this. The dual convergence of, on the one hand, sort of traditional and new media systems. Let's say traditional media systems such as broadcasting and print media, newspapers, radio, government announcements, public service announcements, and those kind of things on the one hand. And this sort of new hybrid media environment that we're all carrying around in our pockets. That consists of social media, of mobile media, of media that are incredibly personal to us, that are customized, that are unique to us. And you put two smartphones together from two different people, and you'll see different apps, different structures, different arrangements, different ways of navigating our information environment. And those two systems have converged. And the second convergence is the convergence of all spheres of life into the home. In other words, our life consists of multiple spheres that we navigate on a day-to-day basis, right? The sphere of the home, of the family, of your friends, of your colleagues, of your fellow students, of the people you play football with in the park, of the men and women you meet at the pub or at the discotheque. I mean, these are all different spheres, and we all act a little bit differently in all these spheres. And we dress differently for work as we do for the sports arena. We dress differently for the disco as we do for going to class. And this is healthy. This is normal. Psychologists would call this self-complexity and show how it is important for us to be able to play these different roles in lives and to keep these roles somewhat separately, because it keeps us sane. If we're exactly the same all the time, we would be robots. But what is happening now is that now during this pandemic, during lockdowns, during #stay-at-home measures, during the insistence of all the authorities and experts in our environment to not leave the house, to work from home, to teach from home, to homeschool at home, obviously, to entertain yourself at home, to meet your friends, everything at home stuck behind these screens, that our different life spheres have completely collapsed. right? I mean, right now, all our different identities are different tabs on our browser window. And I guess what I want to say with that is that this dual convergence of traditional media and new media, as well as all the different spheres of life, all at home, all for us stuck behind these screens, well, nobody's good at this. Let's just please acknowledge that this is frustrating. It's exhausting. I don't know about you, but at the end of every day, I am done. I'm spent. I can't look at a single screen anymore, but I have to. It's exhausting. It's frustrating. It's hard. It's like you have to mix. Right, I'm talking here, and any minute now, my son can walk in because he has a question from school, and then the dogs start barking, and then inadvertently another tab on my browser starts playing a movie that I was watching last night. I mean, it's like all very confusing. And I guess that's really important for all of us to acknowledge and to forgive ourselves and each other for making endless mistakes on a day-to-day basis in how to navigate this incredibly complex media and information environment that we're all in. A fourth point that I want to make, which is an insight that also comes to us from media studies and communication research, is something that's happening in the background that perhaps not all of us are equally aware of, but is, however, I think quite significant, which is the accelerated collapse of the global media industries. The buildings that you see behind me are the headquarters of News Corp and Disney and Time Warner in New York, right? These epic media corporations that many media theorists would claim control the media in the world, and they're super rich and super powerful, and they distribute and control the copyrights of the movies we see on television or in the cinema, and the television shows that get produced, and the newspapers that get printed, and so on and so forth. However, this year, if we look at the balance sheets of these companies, and we look at the news about these companies, which is primarily about how they're all laying off tens of thousands of workers, is that they're crumbling. Now, this has been happening for quite some time. I mean, the decline in newspaper subscriptions and sales started already in the 1980s. The decline of television viewing, regular linear television viewing started in the 1990s. And of course, visits to cinema and everything have been plummeting in the last 10, 15 years or so. However, this year, all of that has profoundly accelerated, in part because we're all at home, and in part because other companies, so-called super competitors, have moved in between us and these media companies. And these, of course, are streaming services like Netflix, but also simply the Googles and the Facebooks and the Baidus of this world that are primarily in the business of distribution and connection, and not in the business of content. And this has turned out to be the Achilles heel of the global media industry. They have traditionally been in the business of producing and distributing content. And we still want that content. It's just now there's somebody else in between that not only provides us access to this content, but arranges connectivity around this access. Like where we jointly watch a streaming program, regardless of where we are in the world, where we chat and tweet and connect over the content that we are watching or experiencing somewhere else, where the primary gateway to news is not the front page of a newspaper, but a story a friend shares on VK or on Facebook. And this introduces an entire new economy, if you will. And again, this was happening before, but it's accelerating, and it's making these businesses, these incredibly powerful corporations, panic. Some of you may have followed the news just the other day about Facebook and Google fighting or accommodating new laws in Australia about paying for the content of media companies that appears on their platforms. And this is actually a really good example of what's happening behind the screens, because this law in Australia was inspired by lobbying efforts by Rupert Murdoch, the CEO of News Corp. And News Corporation and Rupert Murdoch have been complaining for years at least for the last 7 years, 8 years nonstop, that they're losing money to Facebook and Google and other companies like it. And finally, this year, they got the government of Australia to listen to them and to write a new law that even said that linking to somebody should be something that costs you money. In other words, to simply add a link, you should pay for, which would completely undermine the entire World Wide Web. But that's how intense this battle has become over the future of the global media industries. And I'm not saying we should feel sorry for them, but I will articulate that an incredibly sad part of this is to look at the incredible numbers of people being laid off, media professionals being laid off, which is especially significant for our field, for media and communication studies, as the majority of the students in our courses want to work for these media. So that's an important fourth point. A fifth point that I would like to make that relates to the relevance of media and communication in the context of a global pandemic has to do with another type of acceleration, not just the acceleration of the decline of business models of traditional media industries, but the acceleration of digitalization and mediation of, well, everything, but particularly our health and our personal information. Again, this is something that started many, many years ago, but what we've seen happening this year is an incredible acceleration of the development of all kinds of products and services that digitalize the provision of health. Think, for example, about the way the vaccination is being rolled out in countries around the world, generally administered through algorithms that determine who belongs in what group and when they get their vaccine. The current debate about how we're going to facilitate travel in the near future, where everybody will get an app on their phone where they can, with a barcode that tells whoever reads the app what your health status is, right? Whether you've had the virus, whether you've had a test, or whether you've been vaccinated. And that in turn gives you access, for example, to a plane or across a border. And this is fairly profound material that is happening here. This is like, for some, their deepest and darkest fears about global big brother surveillance, and for others, a sort of a liberation of where the digitalization of this data finally sets us free and allows us to do anything we want. The point here that all of this is happening with little or no oversight. Like, I mean, the speed with which, for example, telehealth and remote doctoring or monitoring of intensive care units has been introduced in hospitals and care facilities around the world is just mind-boggling. And we haven't even figured out the implications of all of this. And there's no political control or oversight because pandemic. And so I'm not saying that there's an evil agenda behind all of this, but I am saying that this sort of mediation, the ongoing mediation and digitization of everything, including things that are incredibly personal and embodied, like our health, and what our health allows us or doesn't allow us to do, is happening in the background of all of this. And I think that kind of a critical awareness about this process is key for us to make it through. A sixth point that I want to make has to do with terms and concepts that all of us have heard about this year so many times. I've just lifted headlines from a couple of English language services of the last week or 2 weeks. And it's all about misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. That has created a new world disorder, that it's a plague, that people believe in conspiracies now, and so on and so forth. I mean, it flows to some extent, of course, from a point that I made at the beginning of my talk today, which is this parallel notion of pandemic and infodemic, where having access to bad information can actually be fatal to you if you, for example, refuse to believe in the deadliness of the virus you contracted and you could die because you failed to protect yourself or your loved ones. And an extension for that is this concern, this widespread concern about misinformation, about people not all believing the same information, not trusting public authorities in big enough numbers that would enable, for example, measures to curtail the virus to be more successful than they are. And they are reasonably successful, but still problematic in quite a few areas around the world, which is largely attributed to misinformation, disinformation, and fake news about the virus. What is happening here from a media studies and communication research perspective is the return of the powerful media effects thesis. And which I can explain that, like, where does media studies and communication research as a discipline come from? Well, it comes from a concern of starting in the early 20th century, in, let's say, in the 1920s. So pretty much exactly 100 years ago, a concern with the rise of mass societies, with a corresponding rise of mass media, and a belief that what people would hear and see in the media would directly influence their behavior. And so as media became mass media, and of course in the 1920s, we were talking about print newspapers and radio, the belief was this will program people's minds. If an entire family sits in front of the radio and listen to somebody speak, that would be a direct instruction manual. If what they read in a newspaper is truth, and we should be careful about that. We should worry about that. What if people start believing the wrong things, bad things? That's where the original studies of media came from, a concern about powerful media effects. Now we're 100 years down the line. Our discipline has grown, has flourished, has professionalized, has become the part of schools and departments. And you could argue that its most prominent contribution to scientific research in the world is the realization that media generally don't have powerful effects. And even if they do, those effects aren't clear or the same for everyone. They depend on context. Sometimes the effects have the opposite effect as was intended, and so on and so forth. In other words, the whole discussion about media effects is incredibly complex. It's important, and I'm of course not arguing that media don't have effects. They are profoundly influential. However, that influence, that impact, that effect is diffuse, is complex, and needs to be studied and articulated very carefully. Media have some effects on some people some of the time. That is, in a nutshell, the insight that our discipline has to offer. But it's 2021, and we're back in public discourse, in a story, in a narrative where disinformation kills people. It's like we're 100 years ago in the rise of print newspapers and radio, and we assume that if somebody reads something on a website or on a social media platform, they go outside and pretty much kill themselves because that's what it said. It's not that simple. I'm not saying that misinformation and fake news aren't significant issues and that we shouldn't study. I am saying, however, that we are underestimating the different ways in which people navigate and deal with information. We're underestimating that the reason why people don't trust information from certain sources may not have anything to do with the information, but has something to do with the relationship these people have with institutions. And that these institutions haven't exactly been caring and forthcoming or democratic in the past. And now all of a sudden we should believe them. So it is as much about trust and relationships and care as it is about the factuality of the information in and of itself. A seventh point follows from this point, which is, I'm illustrating this with a picture, a beautiful image made by a French photographer, Anthony Geiger, of people's really intimate relationship with their media, which is that if we look back at the points I've been making thus far, what is clearly needed, and I say this as a media scholar, is that we come up with I wouldn't say new, because so many colleagues are already working on this, but on a truly innovative, creative, and might I even add playful notion of media and information literacy. What do I mean with this? Look, in order to navigate more or less successfully through a world where using media means co-creating reality, where a pandemic and an infodemic run hand in hand, where the real and the virtual have fused everywhere, and especially now at home, where using media is just incredibly difficult and hard. But it's also something we really, really like and love and care about. I mean, we love our media. So all of that, to be successful in all of that is, like I said earlier on, not just incredibly difficult, but at the very least, it requires a very significant investment in some kind of media and information literacy, both at school as well as throughout your adult life, because we all know that the moment we figure out the media that we have right now, new media come along that make you have to relearn everything from scratch. So media literacy is a lifelong project. Understanding what media information do, how they work, how industries work is an incredibly important skill. The problem with, and look, literacy initiatives are emerging all over the world and have been for quite a while now. That's perhaps not the problem. The problem is that the majority of these media literacy initiatives are based on fear. They are designed to weaponize our fear of powerful media. So media literacy is often sold to schools is to prevent your kids for falling into the traps of advertisers or of violent video games or of too much sex on television or something scary on media, like filter bubbles or something like that, and echo chambers. And how do we, oh my God, they're evil. We should run away. We should arm ourselves against all of this seduction. Now, I'm not saying that media aren't in the business of seduction. Remember what I started off with today. We're all in, when we use media, we're in the business of the production of enchantment. And clearly, Time Warner and News Corp are better at producing enchantment than you and I, generally speaking. However, all this fear, this fearful framing of media as the basis for media literacy ignores something quite profound, a point that I've been making perhaps subtly throughout my presentation today, which is we love media. Media gives us pleasure. Media are fun. I mean, why else would we spend all this time with them? Why can we lose ourselves in playing a game? Why can we binge watch an entire season of a television show? Why are we like glued to the pages of the print newspaper when it tells us about something significant happening in our community? Media are why do we freak out when we lose our phones? Right? It's not the phone that we, this just dumb little device. It's our lives that we've just lost. The pictures of the people we care about, their addresses, the chats and the apps that we're getting. I mean, it's like a lifetime of memories, our schedule, what we're going to do next. And yes, how do we going to find out about the weather otherwise? And this love for media, this emotional connection with media, and I go back to Roger Silverstone's book, this almost erotic connection that we have with media, in the sense that it gives us bodily pleasure to spend time with media, is the starting point for literacy and should be. And what that tells us, and what the point that I want to make about literacy, is that perhaps we should think of media literacy not as a defense against misinformation and fake news, but more as emotional literacy. Because how else are we going to be, how can we expect it to handle all this information that comes at us every single moment of every single day? We operate perhaps in this illusion that we're capable of navigating this information space, right? We're fine, especially those of us who had some kind of education. We can deal with this, right? We're good at this. But no, look at these two lovely young women. how much distance is there between them and their devices? How much distance, critical, reflexive distance, where we sit back and go like, let me reflect on what is coming at me on the screen. Like none. There is no difference. Remember the pandemic infodemic, the disappearance of the boundary between the real and the virtual? That used to be a theoretical point, but it's real to us. And because it's real, we cannot then go back to the real to reflect on the virtual. To expect that of each other, of your students, of people in general, is, I think, incredibly naive, perhaps even dangerous, and furthermore ignores that we're not equally powerful in navigating this space. And some people have more to say, have a bigger voice than others. And so that requires an emotional literacy and a way of handling. So I'll give you an example before I start too abstract. And a most common advice that people would give in how to survive this sort of media onslaught, this omnipresent media environment that we're all in, is to sort of take it slow. That's actually the simplest and the most true advice, like relax, take it slow, take a breath. Before you retweet something, before you tell your friends of what you just saw, it's like, well, just breathe, count to 10, right? And those kind of things. Now, what kind of advice is that? That's emotional advice, right? That isn't about, to separate fact from fiction and know when somebody's trying to seduce you to believe something or to make you laugh or make you cry. No, it's a simple argument of saying, well, check your emotions. Right? Appreciate that your heart is beating faster, and take a moment to let it settle down and just to have that emotion, which is totally fine, but not perhaps always act on it, and especially not immediately. Right? You write an angry email and then you always have to sleep on it, or at the very least take a minute, because then you go back to it and realize, yeah, I probably shouldn't send it. So media literacy as a form of emotional literacy. That was my 7th point. And I'm going to conclude my talk today with something that I've mentioned again throughout my talk today. It's the topic of a project that I'm working on right now. And it is, for lack of a better term, about love. And this is something that over the last couple of years, I've been working on a number of research projects and book projects that were about sort of capturing and summarizing sort of the history of theories and research approaches in our field, in media studies and communication research. And so I had to read and study far and wide in areas of the field that were new to me, in studies of media production and content analysis, in studies about how audiences process media and information. And I was reading this and I was looking for what ties it all together. What is the grand narrative? What is it that we're really looking at? And increasingly, and ultimately, inevitably, I've come to the conclusion is that what we're all looking at is at love. I want to illustrate this point with a reference to, again, a book from 1999. 1999 was an important year for some strange reason. And this is a book written by an American colleague called John Durham Peters. And he wrote a book in 1999 called Speaking into the Air. It's a history of the idea of communication. And the argument he develops in his book based on historical evidence going as far back as the origin of time. So it's a long history. But the argument he makes in this book is a gorgeous one. He says that really when we think of communication throughout the human history, what we're talking about is a deep-seated desire that we all have for so-called perfect communication. He calls it angelic communication. What does that mean? Is that when we think about communication, when we talk about communication, especially mediated communication, what we long for is a perfect line between me and whoever I'm communicating with. Think, for example, what we consider to be a perfect romantic couple, like husband and wife, or husband and wife, or whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, it's people who communicate with each other, who understand and respect each other, the number one relationship advice is better communication. What is the worst sentence beyond death we can give to a prisoner? Isolation, right? Not allowing him or her to communicate with anybody. At our hearts of hearts, all our concerns about media and communication, about mediated communication, are about the lack of perfect communication. But, and this is what John Durham Peters shows us, there is no such thing as perfect communication. In fact, communication inevitably is about miscommunication. Let me give an example of how we can all experience this. And it's probably an exercise that we've all done at some point in primary school. Do you remember in primary school that your teacher would set the group of kids in a circle, and then it would whisper in the ear of one child a sentence, a random sentence. And then that child had to whisper the same sentence in the ear of the child next to him, and then go around. And nobody could hear, of course, what they were saying other than the child right next to you. And then in the end of the circle, the last child would stand up and then repeat the sentence. And what always happened is that the sentence at the end of the circle was completely different from the first sentence. There was not even a word the same. How is that possible? And it's because communication, perfect communication, does not exist. It is impossible. All communication is flawed communication. So all our use of media, our messages on Telegram and on WhatsApp, our updates on our social media profiles, the letters we write to our friends and loved ones, the comments we leave on websites, the stories that journalists write, the announcement that governments make. I mean, all of that, every single act of communication is the expression of love, a love for perfect communication. And we never get it right. and I think for me, this realization that all of this is about love, is about this quest for perfection that we will never ever achieve, helps me to tone down my expectations of myself and of others in how we use media, how we make sense of media, and what we can do with media, and helps me forgive when we make mistakes, when we believe the wrong things, when we follow the wrong leaders and those kind of things. Because I know that all of us are deep down inside are doing it from a position of love. Now that may sound a bit mushy or a bit hippie, but I do feel that to talk to people on the basis of love will give you a better shot at reaching some kind of mutual understanding or starting a mutual project than to talk with them on the basis of fear. And like, oh, you should be careful about, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. We all know, especially those of us who are trying to raise kids or teach kids, what really helps? Punishment or encouragement? Encouragement, of course. And that's I think, at the heart of my story today. When I reflect back on the various points that I made. And so the ultimate lesson of media and communication is that we cannot be completely real and true and perfect. And we cannot know anything or anyone like that. But at the same time, we're all in this together. And while we're all doing this, we obviously care deeply about our media and how we communicate and how we're communicated to. And I think once we take that seriously, we can achieve a much better and healthier and emotionally safe media environment than that one we're all in today. And that's my presentation, and I hope we have lots of questions and comments and time to chat.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for this interesting and also encouraging perspective, let's say. So who would like to be the first in asking the question?
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I have two interrelated questions. I'm studying the role of algorithms and artificial intelligence on media. And you mentioned in the beginning that pandemic came simultaneously with infodemic. And for the first time in humans' history. And I think to a great extent, this infodemic came possible because of the growing role of automation and algorithms in the creation of information, distribution of information. So could you please elaborate a little bit further? What is your stance on the role of technologies and the new technological environment in media we now live in? And my second question is interrelated with the first one, and also on your very last point about emotions and love in communication. How do you assess the role of emotions if communication to a great extent now is not human-human communication, or human-non-human communication, or even non-human communication? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olga, for these really great questions. You're kind of opening up Pandora's box there. I'll try to keep it brief. And obviously, these are reflections. These are not really answers, because you're addressing two issues that are very much sort of ongoing and evolving. As first, the role of algorithms, automation, and I'm throwing in machine learning and artificial intelligence in there as well in the current media environment. And it kind of is part of the fifth point I made about the acceleration of digitalization and mediation of just about everything, which is very much sort of that acceleration is in part sort of produced by or helped by automation and algorithms, right? Like I said earlier about the role of algorithms in designing vaccination schedules is a really good example. And of course, algorithms have been playing a profound role in our media environment for quite some time, because every single social media platform is designed around algorithms. Every search engine is designed around algorithms. Every streaming service is designed around algorithms. We have more choice than ever before, and at the same time, more of that choice is actually prescribed through the role of algorithms in all of this. Now, an interesting question for me in all of this is that perhaps you're noticing a tension here between, on the one hand, my argument of this entire presentation, which was a lot about feelings and emotions and even love, and then what is the reality of our media environment right now, which is a reality that is profoundly influenced by automation, robotization, algorithms, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And it almost seems like these are two exact opposites, right? The cold, heartless machine world of automation and artificial intelligence versus the warm human world of love and emotions. And I guess that makes me wary of attributing too much, dare I say, power to AI and algorithms. That doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the fact that they play a profound role, and an especially problematic role when it comes to, for example, making us discover new things or hearing different voices or sources of information, or when algorithms become part of policing practices, or when we become blind to the biases built into algorithms. For example, the way they are privileging certain people over other because those people are just have better data associated with them. I'm not ignoring that and how important all of that is. I'm also not ignoring the fact that a lot of media production these days takes place at the behest of algorithms. In other words, that algorithms determine what a specific market segment of the public will most likely be interested in, and that gets sent as an assignment to a production company. Hey, you should produce a television show about American politics with a little bit of murder and a tiny little bit of sex, and that happened, and Kevin Spacey produced House of Cards for Netflix. So and you could argue, well, how does this relate to, you know, the creativity of media practitioners and their sense of autonomy, making beautiful things, whereas they're increasingly being or journalists. I mean, the Telegraph in the UK just announced that they were considering that they're going to change the way they pay their journalists based on how much clicks the stories of the journalists generate online. Right? In other words, how much algorithms now going to determine what your salary is, which is actually common practice in quite a few news organizations around the world. So all of that, I am not saying all algorithms and AI are not all that important. They're incredibly important. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that is to think of algorithms and AI in human terms, in terms of feelings and of affect. What I mean with that is that all the things that make us imperfect are built into design of the computer, hardware, and software systems that we surround ourselves in. The biggest mistake that we can make is to look at media or at technology or at software or at algorithms as sort of cold, neutral devices or machines or artifacts that operate outside and or independent from us. No, they're very much extensions of us. We are implicated in them, they are implicated in us, and they have intentionality, right? As Kevin Kelly would used to say, like, technology wants something from us, and it gives them non-human actors in this sense agency. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in a long-winded way, is to have an effective approach to the study of AI and algorithms. I think that for me is really important. Now, very quickly on your second question, the role of machine-to-machine communication is, I think, a really important one. I do remember about 4 or 5 years ago was, I think, the first time that the #1 type of communication on the planet wasn't human to human, but machine to machine. In other words, that machine to machine communication took on a larger chunk of how all the wires running throughout the world that facilitate mediated communication, how they are used. That the biggest chunk of data use on the planet was computers talking about us behind our back. And that is a really fascinating story in and of itself, and something that is somewhat missing from my field, I think, and appreciate. So I really appreciate that you're looking at that carefully. And for me, it's interesting to explore how that makes us feel. That most of the communication that happens on the planet Earth isn't between human beings, but is between machines that talk about human beings. And those conversations have consequences, right? They allow us entry somewhere or not. They allow us to board a plane or not. They give us access to certain information and entertainment or not. These conversations have consequences. And how do we relate to that? And what is the role of ethics and transparency in all of this? I think this is a really interesting field and something that, you know, given also the current acceleration of digitalization of just about everything, becomes increasingly powerful. So yeah, in a nutshell, those would be my immediate responses. I appreciate that those might be still fairly vague responses, but important ones coming from my perspective.
I see that Ekaterina would like to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Iliya Vadimovich. Mark, first of all, thank you very much for great and very inspiring lecture, and so for touching a lot of points which are really, really very important. And so I'm doing my research in smart city technologies, and that's why my first question is quite simple, and maybe it could be postponed. So I'm very much interested in your the notion you mentioned, dual convergence. Could you please send us links to the works where this notion is mentioned? But maybe it's just, I mean, like, we can postpone it. But my question is, so first of all, I formulated is what happens to smart city after the pandemic? But I know it's too general, so that's why I would like just to, how to say, to point out to the situation of course, it's very, very primitive sociology, but among my acquaintances, there are a lot of people who are actually feel very comfortable with sitting at home. And so the problem which you mentioned between public and private, between open space and home space, and you explained it as a problem, as something which is uncomfortable. But we see a lot of people who are actually feel very comfortable with it and who are not against like transforming all the activities into the home space. That's why the problem of this code and space is, it looks quite different in different people's minds. And now, for example, I made a sort of a poll with my students if they want to come back to the class, and it's 50-50. Half of my students would like to come back, and half of them, they prefer to stay at home, despite it's now like possible to come back to the classes. And so my question is, so don't you think that actually we do not need so much these personal connections, and so we need how to say, a code, a machine between us, and so some at least some of us feel much more comfortable with it?
Thank you so much for both your kind words and your great question. I've put a couple of links to an article by Christian Fuchs and earlier one myself, where we talk about dual convergence in the chat. For your reference, well, first of all, I think your experience of finding colleagues and some students actually expressing, yeah, that this is quite nice and they're fine living and working from home and just having everything at their fingertips is a good example of what I said earlier about how the powerful media effects hypothesis just doesn't work, right? There is no one size fits all way of dealing with media, and there is no one specific way in which media impacts us. And yes, psychologists would say that self-complexity is a healthy part of humanity, but obviously we all have different ways of handling and managing self-complexity and media to some extent assist us in doing so, and have done this before the pandemic as well, of course. I will say this is that in Japan there is actually a specific term that is reserved for people who choose to live relatively isolated from the rest of the world and organizing everything in life through their media, which is Hikikomori. And this is actually a fairly old phenomenon, at least 10, 15 years old. It's this it's quite possible and increasingly possible to do it that way. And you can think of, and I'm assuming you have that conversation with your students as well, that try to imagine surviving this last year through the pandemic without the internet, or without Zoom or Skype or any of that. I mean, you almost can't imagine, like, how did people find their way in anywhere in the world without Google Maps or something, right? Like, those kind of questions are interesting to ask, because people did just like 10 years ago, no problem whatsoever. But anyways, that's beside the point here. But the notion that we have a media environment now that is so pervasive and ubiquitous and so much, and this is important, I think, fused with life, that it doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore, at least for some, or at least for most of the time. That it's sort of, you just sort of, yeah, go with the flow. And it's like research among children shows, right? You know, putting on your pants in the morning or a dress is the same act as switching on your phone and checking what's going on in the world. There's no distinction. It's like all part of the same kind of ritual. And that convergence, part of the convergence hypothesis of life, it also speaks to the convergence of the real and the virtual, of media and life. And so in a way, it's not surprising that some people find this lovely. On the other hand, what is the product that around the world has sold out most? It's bicycles, right, in this year. You can't get a bicycle anywhere, or a trampoline, or a ticket to access a national park. It's like, we want to go outside. So it's an interesting, what is going to be really interesting in the next couple of years is how we're going to navigate this balance. And for some of us, that will definitely mean either because we have no choice or because that is our choice, is to become a bit more like the Hikikomori. For others, it's like the exact opposite. It's like as far away from smart technologies as possible, right? I mean, French philosophers love to write books about this, about running into in the nature naked, because that's the only true way of being a human. But most of us will be somewhere in the middle, right? Where we're going to have to navigate, find a balance. And I guess my point today is to articulate the complexity of doing so. Because in finding a balance, we somehow expect of ourselves or each other that we can establish some kind of meaningful distance between us and our media that allows us to reflect on them, to look at them, and then make deliberate choices about them. And my point is that I don't think we can do that anymore. I've made that point 8 years ago in a book called Media Life. At that time, it was sort of a fun thinking experiment, but I think today I would say, well, that's what we're all living in and through. And to recognize that we can't really do that anymore and still find ways to think carefully and critically about media is going to be the #1 challenge. And again, I want to reiterate that thinking about media carefully, I think, cannot be done from a perspective of fear, or of like, this is bad for you. It has to be done from an appreciation of love, of how much we love doing all of this, which I think in part explains that half of your students who say like, hell no, I'll just learn from home. This is just fine. I can switch between Call of Duty and your lecture, right? And the other half who says, no, I want to sit next to a student that I can touch and that I can see and that I can smell, and I want to meet people and I want to hang out. So it's a bit of both. It's not either or. And how we navigate that space will be really interesting in the next couple of years, because things won't go back to the way they were before. Not in society and not with media. I mean, I think that has become impossible.
Thank you very much. We have another question. We have a question from Maria. Please.
Yeah. Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. Thank you, Iliya, for inviting such interesting guest. Mark, I have my question is about. At the beginning, I want to refer to it's quite famous. It was very. I want to refer to the article in the Atlantic. It's quite famous American journal.
Mm-hmm.
I think you yeah. And I want to remind the article was highly discussed and led to huge discussion. The article called "Why Young Generation Have Little Sex," but the question is not about sex. The question that there were in that article included many links to current researchers that new generations like 16 plus, yeah. The problem is that a new generation have about the increasing skills of human communication. They live in new generation live in online, and they spend all the time checking on social media. And according to few researchers made in the USA, the consequences of that migration to offline is that young people are not able to communicate in real life. And this is the challenge. And as we see, pandemic and all that global migration to to the internet, global migration to online. I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic or apocalyptic, but what do you think about that? That in few years we will face the huge problem. I think the largest problem in social life, the gap between I don't know, not old generation, but old and new generation. I mean, we will face the world where people stop understand each other because of that. How to say? I don't know. Not technical, but it's another kind of people. I mean, we in few years we will face another sort of people who are not able to talk to each other. I mean, in real life. And this is the what do you think? I think because I as a lecturer, I face that problem with my students.
Right.
I mean, they're really curious. I mean, and you talked about fear, and according to my mind, the best fear for young generation is the fear of leaving contact. And this is the challenge, how we will survive in that new kind of world. Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that comment and that question. Now, there's a couple of different ways of addressing this. I mean, part of it, I put a link in the chat as well. It's a link to a book that was written by two absolutely phenomenal colleagues of mine here at the University of Amsterdam, Patty Valkenburg and Jessica Taylor-Petrovsky, called Plugged In. It's an open access book. You can download it for free from the website of Yale University Press. And it's a summary of 25 years of research on the impact and effects of media on children.
Yes.
And in other words, it's sort of like the most authoritative summary of what we know of what all these media are doing to our children in the world that I know of. It was published a couple of years ago, so yes, it's 3 years old, but I think the conclusions still stand. And if I talk with Patty and Jessica today, I mean, they are ongoingly doing research and they don't find evidence to the contrary of their conclusions. And their conclusions are generally, the kids are going to be all right. So that we could stop the discussion there, right? Is to say that, yes, we certainly can find problematic media use among people, especially young people. We can see that people sometimes perhaps even prefer to communicate via emoji rather than face-to-face, or we can go to a bar and see a group of kids or young people in the corner and they're all on their phones. And the funny thing is, on their phones, they're actually talking to each other, but not face-to-face. And then think, oh my God, they're all turning into robots, right? Or even worse, zombies. And so one way of answering that concern is to look at the research. And that shows that even though all of that is happening, there's simply no evidence to suggest that this in the long term changes something fundamental about the way we communicate, the way we are in the world. And there's countless of studies that show that. That doesn't mean that, oh, let it all go, it's all going to be just fine. No, obviously not. I mean, obviously, the technologies that we use to communicate are designed for one purpose and one purpose only, is to seduce us to spend most, if not all, of our time with them. Right? And that's the good. I mean, anybody who wants to sell you anything, that's what they do. That's their purpose, right? I mean, that's what we do as teachers, right? We seduce students into believing that what we have to say is important and meaningful. And we do that by packaging in scientific jargon or giving an entertaining lecture with lots of cool examples or whatnot. But we're selling a product, and the product is knowledge. And Facebook is selling attention. Right. So, in connection to others. So partly I'm not all that worried. On the other hand, and I think this is important, is how do you inspire? How can you create a critical awareness about what you're doing in media while you're living in media? It relates to a point that I've made earlier. is how to appreciate how incredibly difficult that is, because we're asking from, especially in this case, children or young people, a kind of critical distance from the media that they are completely fused with, and for good reasons. And so that's, and I think that's virtually impossible. Now, that doesn't make the media the problem. It makes finding a way to get at each other in that context the problem. And that's when I want to reiterate that if we do that from a position of fear, if we tell a group of kids that are texting each other and people somewhere else and say, like, this is bad, what you're doing is destroying your brains, you'll turn into zombies and you won't be able to communicate in the real world anymore, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think they go like, oh, you're right, we shouldn't do that anymore? It's like, I always have to laugh, like if you go to a football stadium and a football club has these big posters all around the stadium saying, we say no to racism, which is beautiful, right? It's an important statement to make. Now, do we really think that when a man comes into the stadium who is a racist, who thinks that people who have a different skin color than he has are just lesser people, is looking at the poster and going like, oh, maybe I'm wrong. I shouldn't feel this way. No, of course not. So a nice reminder of how communication is always imperfect, right? So that's why I'm saying, let's turn that around. And perhaps the best way to communicate in a situation like that, where we have legitimate concerns about the media behavior of, for example, our children or our students, is to approach that from the perspective of love. It's like, what do you love doing here? What is making you laugh so much? Can you explain what is happening here? Why is this better than, for example, doing it without the use of your smartphone? And not to say that using your smartphone is bad. I mean, I perfectly understand. I mean, let's not forget the number one reason why young people are so in love with their technologies is because that's pretty much the only part of their lives that exists independent from the prying eyes of their parents and of other authority figures, right? Because we tell kids what they, at least until a certain age, what they should wear and where they can go and what clubs they can join and what schools they go to, and it's like what they eat. I mean, everything is controlled except what they do in a game or in a chat application with their friends. And we are surprised that that's what they prefer to do. It's like, finally, they're outside of our purview, right? Finally, they have something of their own. So, and that's what looking at this from a perspective of love tells me. So I'm not dismissing your concern. I mean, I see it too. I mean, I've got an 8-year-old. I know what this is like. But I'm trying to, and I'm not saying that what I'm doing is better. I'm just saying that's also a way of approaching this, if that makes any sense. But in my heart and based on the research that I know is ultimately I will say, I think the kids are going to be all right. And will future generations communicate and act differently from us? Oh, absolutely. But that's not necessarily better or worse than we are doing it. It will always be flawed because we can't communicate well. That's impossible.
Thank you very much. What about your time, Mark?
Oh, I'm fine. I've canceled them. I used this as an excuse to cancel a meeting.
Okay, very good. So in this case, we have a question from Anna Machulina, please. Anna.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation. It was really fascinating for me. I'm a student and I'm doing a research work at university. So one of the topics I would like to ask you to comment on, it sounds like environmental or maybe ecological implications of digital transformation of media under the influence both of the pandemic and the fourth industrial revolution.
And when you say ecological and environmental, what do you mean exactly?
It's something that confuses me too, because it is stated in my research work that I should make some research on this topic, and I don't really understand what do they mean when they say environmental implications of the industrial revolution or something like this. Maybe it's about what you have told us, some consequences of this pandemic, maybe something like this, but I'm not sure.
No, I appreciate your question, and I'd love to help you with your homework, and I guess what I would say, based on what I talked about today, is that there's two ways of thinking about the environment of media and the environmental impact. And on the one hand, you can take this quite literally and saying that our media use has profoundly destructive implications for our natural environments. Think, for example, of something as simple as the materials that your phone is made of, or your computer, the one that you're looking at right now. It's filled with all kinds of precious minerals and materials that are generally mined in African countries under quite inhumane circumstances. Child labor, unsupervised mining operations, people getting killed or drowned because of landslides, because things are not operated safely. And those materials are essential to making our devices. And secondly, when these devices are put together, often in factories in China, in Taiwan, this happens quite often, again, not with a whole lot of oversight and with little or no recognition for labor rights. So you see factories across China where there's bars in front of the windows of where the living quarters of employees to prevent them from committing suicide, because the labor circumstances are so inhumane, where they do 16 to 18 hour shifts a day to put your new iPhone together. And now there is luckily more and more control and oversight over this, and companies like Microsoft and Apple and Sony have pledged that they will invest more in these kind of things, but it's an important environmental impact. And then think about how many phones have you owned in your life already? We generally replace our technologies every year and a half or so. Our televisions, our computers, our laptops, our smartphones. Where does all this old stuff go? Well, 80% of all media technologies that we throw away ends up on illegal dumps, again, most often back in Africa. And what happens there is that people get sick and die who live near these dumps because of the toxic fumes, because there's an entire industry where people burn down computers and smartphones to rescue these precious minerals that are inside of them to sell them on the black market. So, and of course, these materials themselves aren't ecologically friendly, recycled or something like that. It's plastics and everything that are just dumped in places in parts of the world where we generally don't have cameras. Right? So, I mean, if we want to talk about the environmental impact of the media and of the Industrial Revolution, that's definitely one way of looking at this, right? And so that's me interpreting your question quite literally. But there's a different way of thinking about environment when it comes to our media. And I want to reference a book that's going to come out in any day now, published by the MIT Press, written by two very dear friends of mine called Pablo Boskovsky and Evgenia Michelstein. This book is called The Digital Environment. And why am I mentioning this book? Because it is one of the first books that I know, and it does so in an incredibly accessible and friendly way, that urges us to think about media as an environment rather than, for example, television, phones, computers, books, newspapers. But they say now all of that is together is an environment, and we don't really make the distinctions between these different media anymore. Partly because they are all digital and they all live on our phone, but partly also because our experience and our use of them is almost seamless. Like we switch, and we generally use multiple media at the same time, right? The TV is on, we're paging through a magazine, and we're on the phone with our best friend. So media are better understood in today's context as an environment within which we sort of navigate space and time. And that's a really fascinating way of looking at things. And you could argue that the evolution of media has led from distinct media, with distinct uses, like, for example, the newspaper for information and radio for fun, to a media as an environment within which our entire lives play out, and where the distinction between the real and the virtual has completely disappeared. So that's another way of thinking about environment and environmental impact of media, right? If media are your environment, it becomes much easier to understand that it is really hard to think of media critically, because you have to think of the environment as a whole. Now, how do you do that? That is incredibly tough and incredibly hard, but also incredibly important. So those would be my two associations with the word environment. I hope you can use them in your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And this is really something to think about and how to develop the topic. So really appreciate your answer. And I also have one question, if you don't mind. It's about key beneficiaries of this digital transformation of media. Which key beneficiaries do we have when we talk about this fourth industrial revolution or about the pandemic? So who are these key beneficiaries?
Well, I guess what I find interesting is to think about, your question is really important, right? Who are the winners and losers of this year and in terms of media? And then we can see, well, the big winners, and I think we can all mention them quite quickly, would be Zoom, the platform that we're all on right now, that nobody had heard of, almost nobody before the pandemic, and now everybody in the world is using it. And even though we already had things like Skype and so on and so forth. Zoom and Netflix. Now, what do Zoom and Netflix have in common? On the face of it, you would say nothing other than that they both live on our computers, right? On our devices. But I told you earlier that what really inspires me is to look at everything when I look at media and communication in terms of love. And if I look at Zoom and Netflix in that way, it's like, what do Zoom and Netflix bring us? Well, Zoom, of course, brings us contact with people we care about. And those people could be our family members, our friends, but also our students, our colleagues. Yes, we all get tired and exhausted from endless Zoom meetings, and I please know how much I appreciate everybody sticking around and logging on for today. But it's also something that, you know, like I said earlier, can we imagine surviving this pandemic sitting at home without Zoom, without this kind of contact, at least with somebody that we can see, with this kind of connection? And that's love, right? It's like, oh, I can't touch you, but I can touch you, right? Digitally. And Netflix, in a way, does this too. Because quite literally, because it offers opportunities for connective viewing, right? Where you can simultaneously watch a program even when you're in India and somebody else is in Moscow and your other friend is in Brazil. But more, I think, significantly is that, of course, the whole menu of Netflix, everything you see when you log into Netflix is a recommendation based on data generated by you and people like you, right? So in that sense, it's a social recommendation engine. Furthermore, what makes certain Netflix shows so popular, and that what makes us binge watch all of them, is because we're all talking about things that are on Netflix all the time. And Netflix, of course, inspires that and promotes that. So there is this sort of feedback loop between something you watch in the privacy of your own home on Netflix that generates data that in turn informs decisions that other people are making. You're then watching this thing together with others, or you're telling others about it so then they will go and watch the same things. You have something to talk about. And I guess that's something we often forget, is that the number one reason people consume media is to talk about those media with others. So who is gaining, who is winning from a media and communication perspective in this pandemic, I think are the kind of companies that give us connections with others, that are in the business of connecting us. That's why traditional media industries are struggling, especially this year. And the companies that are in the business of monetizing distribution and connection are gaining. right? I mean, the tech industry as a whole and social media companies in particular, whether that's Tencent or Baidu or Google or Facebook, their annual figures have skyrocketed this year. And so yes, in that sense, but beyond seeing that, we have to see carefully, so what is it that they're doing for us? Right? Well, they're connecting us to others, and that is ultimately what we want, right? Remember what I said earlier about the love we have for communication, and especially perfect communication, this fundamental desire to be in contact and be seen and understood. And that's the brilliance of these companies. They've monetized that aspect of our humanity. That's also the scary part, right?
Thank you very much, Mark. And I think we have a question in chat. This is a question from our colleague Katarzyna Kapic from University of Marie Curie Skłodowska from Lublin in Poland. Mm-hmm. So I will ask Mark to react somehow on it.
I will, and lovely to see you, Katarzyna. I really appreciate you logging on as well. Katarzyna asks, don't you think that at the current moment, the so-called infodemic has become a sort of a mainstream keyword of social science discourse, but little is said about freedom of speech and freedom to ask questions about, for example, the pandemic? Doesn't the fight against so-called infodemic or the infodemic require open communication and then not ignoring any of the questions, and certainly not ignoring or even discrediting the questioners, especially in so-called mass media? I observed the situation in Poland, and how can we achieve any kind of understanding if there's no real discussion? And I think that's a really important point, and that I really appreciate, because I share your concern about the sort of wholesale adoption of infodemiology as a field of study. And like I said earlier, I have significant questions about labeling everything as misinformation and disinformation disorders and plagues and fake news, you know, as sort of the ultimate problem in our society. Because at the heart, I mean, look, we cannot achieve perfect communication. I know we want to, but we can't. And so the only way to get closer to that ideal of truly creating a space where we can all share our concerns and our messages and our intentions in a way, it requires not sort of getting people all to buy into a single truth or to get everybody behind the science of climate change. Of course, I would love that, but that's not going to happen. What would be much more important about communicating here is listening. Tanya Dreher, a colleague of ours in Australia, has written this beautiful essay, I think it was in 2006, about the need to listen across difference. Which is, she said that in all the rhetoric about communication and how we need better communication and free speech and everything, which is all about sending, right? Better ways of sending. It's like, what about better ways of receiving? Of learning the skill to listen to people and ideas that are truly different. And that's hard, because it requires you to at least set aside for a moment your own beliefs and ideals. No matter how much they are based on evidence and truth, it doesn't matter. Somebody will come at you with something completely different. And that's equally valid, or at least valid enough to be taken seriously and to be heard. My very dear South African colleague and friend Herman Wasserman has just published a book with Oxford University Press called The Ethics of Listening, right? And talking about that yeah, there's lots of stories to tell, for example, on the African continent. But what we really need is an ethics of listening, learning to listen with care and compassion to those that are different from us. And I think those kind of perspectives are really important here. So not to label anybody who believes in something that you don't believe in or that you consider for whatever reason as dangerous as, you know, a conspiracy theorist or a nutcase or a whatever. and also to appreciate that the people who are truly lost in sort of conspiracy-related filter bubbles are a relative minority. And I'm not saying that that is not without consequences. We all know the storming of the Capitol. But that wasn't because the algorithms of Facebook, that was because of a certain political leader who was in charge of the United States at the time, fueling these fires based on his authority. So regardless of whether you agree or didn't agree with him. So I think, Katarzyna, this is a really important point. And I go back to my love argument, is that a loving perspective on communication isn't so much about better ways of sending, but more empathic ways of receiving information.
Thank you. Probably we have some other questions. The last one, yeah? Or not? It seems there are no more questions. Thank you very much. Mark, I would like to it was a very brilliant and interesting talk, and we can see a lot of questions on, especially inspired by your talk. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you later on